Be a very exciting hour for those of you that are here to see and hear from Mr. Skip Bruce. He has some real exciting things to say, and then immediately after that we are going to be giving out scholarships for our STEM graduates, or math and science students from all over the state. We don't know how many have signed in, but last year we did quite well. Everyone got a scholarship. So this year I got a feeling it's going to be the same. This is a great time for our organization because we have, not only do we have a great speaker here, Skip Bruce I've known for years, and of course many of you have heard of him if you don't know him personally. He had worked for the Department of Energy and Labor and Economic Growth in Michigan. He was on Senator Granholm's energy director. He founded the Five Lakes Energy Group, LLC, in Michigan. And currently, Skip has stayed very active in the state of Michigan, very passionate about what's taking place not only in Michigan, but what I hope you're going to hear today is a very solid, broad overview of climate change and how it relates to energy and how it relates to all of us. And I thank you for being here. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Skip Bruce. Just one real quick announcement. Bruce McAtee is here from Senator Peters' office, and he will be here through the presentation and for the scholarship presentation as well, and then he has to leave. So anyone that wants to meet, he's new with the organization, with Mr. Peters, so thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, John. What a wonderful organization. Scholarships for 5 or 6 kids, that's fantastic. Should be very, very proud of that. So I'm going to talk about energy and climate and where we are. This is sort of a big picture presentation. I think everyone realizes that climate and energy are inextricably interrelated, and if we're going to attempt to address climate change, we essentially have to eliminate the carbon contribution from our global energy system. So I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges in doing that, formidable as they are, and then I intend to leave you with some data and information that I think suggests that we could possibly meet those challenges and that we just have a chance of getting this done. But in order to do that, I need a device to change the slides.
I know. There's a clicker, but it's delayed. So the better
Is it a little louder?
Oh, this. Okay.
It's delayed, or you can use that. How about this?
That's great. Okay, so, but before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of context because there's a lot that has happened in the climate and energy realm, and I'm just going to touch a few of the high points that have occurred real recently. For instance, 2014, hottest year on record. The red and blue are the deviations from normal temperatures. The dark red are record temperatures around the globe in 2014. 2015 looks like it will be warmer still. We have an El Nino that is formed in the Pacific, and it is transferring ocean heat to the atmosphere. The first quarter of 2015 is by far the warmest first quarter globally since 1880, when the instrument record began. In addition to that, Antarctica recently has had its highest temperatures ever measured. We learned in 2014 that the ice sheets in Greenland and East Antarctica, which we knew were melting at the surface, were also melting from the bottom. That warmer ocean waters were actually eroding these ice sheets from the bottom, dislodging them from bedrock and accelerating the progression of the glaciers into the ocean. In late 2014, we learned that the same thing was happening in East Antarctica, where we thought that was going to be stable for thousands of years and perhaps even offset the ice losses in West Antarctica. So the Totten ice field, a huge glacial network, is also eroding from the bottom and moving out into the ocean. So there were good news recently as well. So huge is that in 2014, greenhouse gas emissions actually went down slightly. That was really unexpected and particularly surprising in the absence of a global recession. So that was really good news. And that trend is continuing in 2015. And it may be attributable largely to other good news in China. In China in 2014, Chinese coal consumption was down 11%. That was also unexpected. The forecasting earlier in 2014 is that China was going to be at peak coal around 2030. But they went down 11% in 2014, and was that a blip? And were they going to resume combusting a lot of coal? Well, it's down another 8% in 2015, and Chinese greenhouse gas emissions are down 5% in the first 4 months of 2015. So good news there as well. So also in 2014, two hugely important scientific efforts, right? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued its 5th assessment report, multiple volumes. This is an effort, I'm sure most people are aware. It involves the review of literally thousands of climate-related peer-reviewed scientific papers by hundreds of climate scientists who have the task of digesting all this information and coming up with written positions and advice for global policymakers, which you can appreciate is inherently a very conservative process. But one of the many findings is that continued emissions of greenhouse gases will result in systemic disruption of the global climate system. And the only way of disrupting that is by substantial and sustained reductions in emissions. In 2014, we also had the National Climate Assessment issue, which is required to be done every 5 years under federal law. It's focused on the United States, obviously, but it issued its report in multiple reports in 2014. Chapter 18 is on the Midwest region, and the reports are very accessible. You can go online. They're really quite fascinating. But it concludes as well that in order to reduce emissions substantially, as we must, we essentially have to decarbonize our economy. And in order to do that, what's required is a fundamental change in how we produce energy and use energy in this country. Next slide. So, first major challenge. The IPCC work gave us a carbon budget. Actually, other science gave us a carbon budget as well. And that carbon budget limits or suggests that we should emit no more than 850 gigatons of carbon into the biosphere if we want to have a 50% chance of keeping global temperatures from exceeding 2 degrees centigrade, which is arguably arbitrary, but the point at which the science is telling us that climate change may be catastrophic and irreversible. So the bad news is, at the end of 2014, we're at already 600 gigatons or billion tons of carbon that has been released into the biosphere. Next slide. We'll go back for a second. So in the developing world, and you've heard this, among developing countries, the OECD, in order to keep under that 2 degrees, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the developing world by about 80% or more by 2050. So the US has a greenhouse gas emission target for 2050, which is an 83% reduction. But to render this even more graphic is, here's the trend on the combustion of fossil fuels. So this slide is a little bit dated, but suffice it to say that in the entire history of civilization, we have burned 50% of all fossil fuels in the last 25 years. And so if we are going to do this, if we are going to keep temperatures less than 2 degrees centigrade, we have to turn that into a bell curve right away. And in the next 35 years, we have to be down to near zero. Next slide. So here's the second challenge. As the UK Energy Research Centre and many others have said, and are concluding now, is we have to keep this carbon in the ground, right? And according to this study, 80% of the world's known coal reserves have to remain in the ground, 30% of oil, 50% of natural gas. We can play with these numbers, move them up and down, or change them. But here's the challenge. Some of these resources are owned by governments, but many of these resources are owned by private companies. ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, in Russia, Gazprom, Rosneft, other energy conglomerates around the world. And their shareholder value, the value of their fossil reserves is estimated to be between $7 and $11 trillion. So we are essentially telling these companies whose shares are owned by many, many people in pension funds and whatever, that they have to strand these assets. That these assets really aren't going to have value in the future. Big challenge. Next slide. So, third challenge, all right? We have to have an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions globally, yet energy use is going to increase by about 60%, it's estimated, by 2050. Not so much in the developing world, it's going to be flat or going down. And we have, as I said, we have some evidence that that's occurring. But that 1.1 billion people who are not electrified today, they will be electrified tomorrow. In fact, they have to be. Their prosperity is dependent upon electrification. And many, many other hundreds of millions of people are underserved by electricity. They must improve their service. So that's a challenge. Next slide. So what does it mean in simple terms for the U.S.? In the electric power sector, the transportation sector, and in the industry sector, industrial processing, we essentially have to be at zero by 2050 in those sectors to reach our target. Wow. Next slide. So this is a very recent graph produced by Mark Jacobson from Stanford, but this is what it would look like for the United States. And I have some more information from Jacobson, which you'll see in a moment. But he has created plans to determine the amount of energy from wind, water, and solar that we would need to displace all combustion and all nuclear power in every state in the United States and in the world. And this is very recent. This is April 2015 revisions of refinement of this work. But at any rate, you see by 2040, most of power being supplied by wind and solar under this scenario. You see end-use energy efficiency being very important. But this is what I want to point out here. This is the added efficiency gained by electrifying the U.S. economy through the energy conversion efficiency of electric motors, which is substantial. Next slide. So, where are we headed? Some optimism here, despite all that. Next slide. So, in 2014, 164 countries now have renewable energy policies and programs. 164. That's a 400% increase in 10 years. Next slide. So, we also have a huge number of studies, more coming out all the time, that actually look at what is entailed in transforming the global energy system into renewable energy resources. And the most recent being Jacobson's refined work issuing in April of this year. But there are lots of these studies. And these high penetration renewable scenarios, which only 3 or 4 years ago, many policymakers just thought that this was batshit crazy stuff, right? Are being taken very, very seriously. And I would suggest to you being validated. So what has happened in the last 60 days? In the last 60 days, Hawaii has enacted into law a 100% renewable energy plan by 2045. Vermont has enacted into law a 75% renewable energy plan by 2030. And on Tuesday of this week, the Senate in California, the 7th largest economy in the world, passed legislation that will require a 50% renewable energy standard in California by 2030.
Nice.
So it is happening. So these studies, by and large, find that we can do this, that the challenges are not technical, nor are they economic, they are social and political. In fact, the International Energy Agency, in their calculation, in their 2014 outlook, not the EIA outlook, but the IEA outlook, International Energy Agency outlook, if we make this transition incrementally to a zero carbon global economy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050, we would avoid $71 trillion in fossil fuel expenditures. Next slide. So, looking at just one of these studies, and this study is old, and because it issued in June of 2012, this NREL 4 volume study focused only on the United States and only on the electric generation sector. The information is very dated. As everyone in this room, I think, appreciates, 3 months changes everything in our work, right, in our world, because the advancements and are moving forward and the costs are going down. But at any rate, this was a very serious attempt to look at the feasibility of transitioning the entire power generation sector in the U.S. to be 80% powered by renewable energy by 2050. It concluded that in order to do that, we would have to add 20 to 45 gigawatts of renewable energy every year between now and 2050. Let me point out that in 2013 in the US, we added 13.3 gigawatts of wind, 3.3 gigawatts of solar, so about 17 gigawatts in the absence of any coherent federal policy and disparate state policies. We almost met that low end of what we need to do without even trying in 2013. We're currently expending amounts on transmission that is in the ballpark of what needs to be expended according to NREL in order to have a transmission system that's capable of accommodating this change. But here's the most important bullet. I keep going to this microphone, there's not even a microphone. I can walk around. This one. Adequate supply and demand side resources to meet hourly demand in every region under all modeled scenarios. So in every modeling scenario that NREL did, and there were hundreds if not thousands, they found that renewable energy could meet all demand in every part of the United States every hour of the day. Next slide. And so there are many modeled results. This one is just one of them, but this is 90% renewable energy in the United States by 2050. They have this at 18% solar, 42% wind, only 10% coming from natural gas, coal, and nuclear. And I would submit to you that the literature coming in and what we're actually doing in the field in the United States and globally suggests that 18% solar by 2050 is very low. But this was 2012, remember. Next slide. So this is Mark Jacobson's work released in April of this year. These are the resources that we would have to add the United States to have 100% of our energy come from wind, water, and solar. No nuclear, no combustion of any kind, no biomass. Even aviation fuel is now hydrogen through electrolysis from renewable energy. All right? We would need 328,000 5-megawatt onshore turbines, 156,000 offshore wind turbines. You see this, look at this huge number, 75 million 5-kilowatt solar systems, residential, meaning essentially every house that can accommodate a solar system that has the configuration and, and the sunshine would get a roof. And you see these numbers. We can play with these numbers. Jacobson can do these numbers. We can add more wind and have less solar. But these seem like incredibly daunting numbers, right, on first blush, or maybe not. So this is what we would have to build in 35 years, okay? Think of it this way. We build 17 million cars in this country alone every year. We can build these wind turbines. Next slide. So, transitioning the U.S. power supply. Next slide. So, Michigan is sort of representative of the country. Our average power generation infrastructure is 52 years old. We have to replace everything in the next 35 years. We want to replace it with the most economically efficient power available. We want it to be, it has to be resilient, it has to be stable, it has to be reliable. We want the least amount of future risk, right? And taking into account the possibility of further regulation about taxes, about climate change, the exigencies of climate change and what that might mean to the energy supply. And what about obsolescence? We certainly don't want to pick technologies that are going to be obsolete in the future. Next slide.
Yeah.
So this is Lazard. This is they do this every year. This is 2014. It's interesting to see how much the levelized cost of energy changes from these various technologies year to year. Okay, and what you see if you looked at 2013, 2012, 2011 is renewable energy technology is going down in price. Fossil fuel technology is generally going up because any sector that's dependent upon extraction and processing is likely to see increased costs in the future. So what's the cheapest resource available? Wind at $37 to $81 a megawatt hour. This is unsubsidized. There are wind contracts out west that have the PTC that are at 17. Energy efficiency, of course, is the most economic, but even combined cycle natural gas is more expensive than wind. So levelized cost of energy, that's capital cost, that's operation and maintenance, that's fuel cost, it may include insurance, sometimes it includes financing, sometimes not. Next slide. But it never includes health and environmental impacts in the LCOE. This is work done by Paul Epstein at the Harvard Center for Health and the Global Environment. And he passed away about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. But what he did with his team, and there's actually new literature on this that just came out. I just haven't turned it into a slide. There's another major study. But he sought to monetize all of these impacts. And what he came up with is that the total damages in the U.S. economy, total cost, is somewhere between $175 and $523 billion annually. And if we were to add that cost into the cost of fossil fuel-based electricity, we would be adding 9 to 27 cents per kilowatt hour. So this is a real cost. Not attending to this and not counting this is a subsidy. It is, in fact, a subsidy. Next slide. And speaking of subsidies, just this slide is old, but at the end of 2010, 92% of federal subsidies went to nuclear and oil and gas. Next slide. So you all know this information, okay? The cost of wind going down, it's now at around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. We've tripled the amount of wind between 2008 and 2012 that was deployed in the U.S. Next slide. In Michigan, in 3.5 years, the cost of wind went down 60%. The first commercial utility scale wind farms were at $125 a megawatt hour. Now they're at $50 a megawatt and below. Next slide. Solar energy. We have a bunch of solar installers here. We're sub $3 a watt. For utility scale, we're approaching $2 a watt, if not below. In 2009, we got a grant to contract with McKinsey. We wanted expert visioning for a for solar energy in Michigan. And so we asked McKinsey to tell us what the cost of solar would be in coming years. And unfortunately, what McKinsey delivered to us after doing a whole lot of work was that solar would be between $6 and $7 a watt in 2020. That's how fast, McKinsey is good, right? They blew cell phones a number of years ago as well, but they're good. Next slide. So this is the forecast for 2015, 2016. This has held true for the last couple of years. Every 18 months, we deploy in the U.S. as much solar as we have done in the last 10 years. That's been holding for the last 30 years, excuse me. So it's going up. It's projected to fall off if the ITC is not renewed. Next slide.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Will it get renewed?
Go ahead.
Go back to the next slide. So it falls. It ends at December 2016. There will be tax extenders. The question is, we have 180,000 people employed in the solar industry in the United States, and more every day. It's becoming very big. We have Green Tea in Georgia. We have Deb Dooley now in Florida. We have political change occurring around the country. It's possible that this gets extended again. I would bet against it, but we'll recover. So another fact here, though, indicative of how fast things are changing. At the end of 2014, globally, we had deployed 177 gigawatts of solar and 370 gigawatts of wind. In 2014, and that's 544 gigawatts of wind and solar globally. In 2014, 135 gigawatts of that was deployed. So a quarter of all of the solar and wind deployed in the world was deployed in 2014. Next slide. And my last slide. So thanks for bearing with me. So these are the forces, some of the forces driving change. And I want to go through them. I'll do that very quickly. Apologize that I have 17 listed. We've already gone through the first. Fossil fuels and renewable energy costs are on different trajectories. And there are a couple of reports out in the last month or so, one from IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, indicating that globally they expect the cost of installed solar to fall another 40% in 2 years. Okay. Number two, market opportunities and investment trends. Renewable energy is going to have about $500 billion per year in investment by 2020. It needs to go to $1 trillion by 2030. I think that's likely to happen. I don't know, but if I was betting, I would say it would. Financial institutions are getting very comfortable in financing renewable energy, particularly projects. They know it's safe. They know it's a reliable return. So that is happening. Demand side pressure, really important phenomenon, right? We have Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, IKEA, Costco, Whole Foods, Walmart. All of these companies, the biggest, fastest growing companies in the world, have 100% zero carbon goals for energy supply. Apple, Facebook, and Google co-signed a letter to the Speaker of the House in North Carolina and the Senate Majority Leader in North Carolina, telling them, essentially, if you want continued investment by our companies, you better not freeze your renewable portfolio standard, which they were debating in the legislature. Fuel cost and market volatility. There is a cost to volatility. Even with the sharp decline in gasoline prices and the price of oil falling to $60 a barrel, there's the financial institutions that provided the capital for the fracking plays around the country, they are suffering. So Volatility means uncertainty, uncertainty means risk. You can quantify and monetize risk. It always costs money. Efficiency in conservation. Very big deal. Behavioral conservation. I would submit to you, and I think we're seeing this now with demand response, advanced energy management, automated controls, smart appliances. We are going to have as much elasticity on controlling the demand side as we have on the supply side. And that's going to be very, very important, and it's going to mean an entirely different way of managing energy. Building codes. Title 24, recently passed in California. Every new home in 2020 has to be net zero energy in California. Every new commercial enterprise in California has to be zero net energy by 2030. The way California goes, so goes the rest of the nation. Michigan, Mississippi, Alabama, we're the caboose, but it will get here someday. Regulation and taxes, it's a concern for fossil fuels, right? If it's not the EPA Clean Power Plan, if it is not the METS rule, it's talk of cap and trade, it's talk of a carbon tax. These are uncertainties and additional costs that will plague the fossil fuel industry for all time. Stockholder concerns. In the last couple of years, the Security and Exchange Commission, which requires and enforces the fiduciary obligation of corporations to make full disclosures of risk to their shareholders, now requires oil companies and fossil fuel companies and utilities to begin to disclose the risks associated with climate change. Very big deal. Insurance. So particularly in the secondary insurance market, Lloyd's of London, Munich Re, Swiss Re, they have to throw out their actuarial tables and come up with a new system of assessing risk, right? 2012 or 2013, there's $60 billion worth of storm-related damage from Sandy. The actuarial tables that look backwards for 30 years for that data are no longer relevant in a atmosphere and a biosphere charged with additional energy and water vapor. Finance and asset management. So we have banks declaring they will no longer build or finance the building of coal plants all over the world. We have the World Bank doing that, the European Union Bank, even Bank of America, which Jon Stewart calls it a different name, but Bank of America recently announced that they will no longer, absent special circumstances or extraordinary circumstances, finance any new coal plants around the world. We also have tremendous pressure for divestment now. The divestment movement within colleges and universities in the United States is the fastest growing divestment movement in history. Georgetown just announced they were divesting from coal. Stanford is divesting. Been working at University of Michigan. They will probably be among the last to do that. But pension fund managers, asset fund managers are all concerned about this. The Bank of England announced that they are going to assess the possibility of a carbon bubble and their future investments in fossil fuels. So that is happening. Distributed generation, exponential growth. I was at a roundtable meeting in New York City with energy experts. There were about 20 from the utilities, from the Public Service Commission, from NYSERDA, and Steve Cornelli, who is the Vice President of Policy for NRG Energy, which serves 21 million customers in New England. He, in response to the question to the group, what is your vision for energy in the future, said, we see 50 to 70% of all power generation being behind the meter by 2030. And no one at that table took him on that assertion. So it's happening. Resiliency, critical facilities, hospitals, fire departments, police stations would like to get microgrids. They are being built, particularly in New England. Hospital complexes, university campuses, industrial parks. They will be moving to more and more of them to adopt CHP, combined heat and power, and microgrids. Sustainability, very big deal. You know, it's not just a buzzword anymore. It goes deep. It goes into product designs. All large companies virtually now have significant presence and resources in the area of sustainability, but most interesting, I think, is companies like General Motors and Walmart and others that are requiring sustainability reporting from their supply chain. They are requiring their supply chain now to audit their greenhouse gas emissions, and that signals a lot of change. Water availability. This is a whole nother talk, but there's competition between our agriculture and energy for water, between utilities for thermoelectric generation, need a lot of cooling water. In the Great Lakes, 76% of all water withdrawals in the Great Lakes is for thermoelectric cooling, all right? It's not consumptive use. Very little of that is actually consumed, but they use a lot of water for cooling. But what we're seeing around the world happen big time in France, it happens in the US every year, is some nuclear plants and some coal plants have to power down or shut down because there either isn't enough water to cool because of prolonged drought, or the temperature of the water is elevated because of prolonged heat waves. So thermoelectric generation, this is my point, faces some hurdles on an ongoing basis when you take into account climate change. Energy security, why isn't Congress, why isn't policymakers listening to the most authoritative and respected voices? Pardon me?
Bureaucrats.
Yeah, bureaucrats. But the Department of Defense is taking climate change very seriously. All branches of the U.S. military have renewable energy goals. They are meeting those goals. They issue reports indicating that climate change must be taken into account in national security planning, that climate change is threatens global destabilization, multi-theater threats, because entire regions can suffer from drought and destabilize governments. So, why aren't they listening? Should add this. Camp Grayling, our National Guard base, may be the first military facility in the country that's triple net zero. Net zero energy, net zero water, net zero waste. Climate change. It's finally happening, I think, in the US, right? We've been pretty benighted about this, but I think the public is beginning to understand that climate change is real, that it's caused by human action, and this should be the biggest force driving change of all, and I think will be. And then I just added the moral imperative with the Pope's encyclical and the fact that religious leaders around the world with congregations that add up into the billions are now going to be getting a message on climate change. So here's the whole point, all right? None of this is static. All of these forces are growing in strength. All of them are accelerating. So my thesis to you is the confluence of all of these factors just may get us there. We may be able to do this.
Yep, open Q&A, so you can go.
If income inequality got us into this situation, and it is increasing, don't we have to address that as well as one of the problems of climate change?
Yeah. What can I say? I mean, that's huge. How do we? There will be inequalities. There are inequalities today in terms of the deployment and the beneficiaries of renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. We have to deliver these technologies and these services to low-income populations. I mean, that's a small aspect of this, I know, but it has to happen. In Traverse City, near where I live, we have one of the world's few low-income net zero housing projects, brand new.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that the 1% got us into this situation.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm not.
How fast is China moving towards
So,
zero use of carbon?
so China is moving, they are deploying more renewable energy than anyone in the world by far. So Obama and the Chinese signed in December a climate accord. Recall that? The U.S. committed to a 26 to 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 from a 2005 base year. China agreed to peak emissions in 2030. Fox News, Wall Street Journal went crazy about the, quote, asymmetry, unquote, of the commitments. China isn't doing anything, right? For China to be to peak in emissions by 2030, they have to build a power generation capability equivalent to the entire United States power supply by 2030. Yes, sir.
I'm an educator in the UP, and I'm exploring solar on school roofs because you have a lot of flat real estate. You have institutions that are desperate to make money because of budget cuts, and I'm trying to explore whether that solar could leverage schools to some financial freedom by taking care of those electrical expenses. Can you steer me in any directions that would help?
So I want to come over there and hug you because that is the, one of the most important things you could do. Setting aside the economics for the school, if you can pull it off for a moment, what you do when you build that solar array at a school, you involve the students, you bring curricula, the science teachers get involved, the administrators get involved, the parents get involved. Suddenly you have a thing of pride for the entire community and the school when you do that. And it's a really powerful educational tool in doing that. We had a program in Michigan called Energy Works. We deployed solar at 32 schools, I think, K through 12, around the whole state. It was in 2011, the Attorney General sued to stop the program and was successful. But yeah, crowdfunding, various different ways of getting the PTA, the community engaged in funding that for your schools. I mean, we could talk later. There are nascent efforts at this around the state, including Traverse City. There's a guy in Detroit who administered the Energy Works program for the state. He did a phenomenal job, and he may resurrect it. So we can connect on that. Ann.
First, I don't know if everybody knows that Skip is probably the person most responsible for Michigan having an RPS and energy efficiency.
Pretty generous for a lot of people.
But one of the things that was critical was that you were able to move the proper political forces forward and make it inevitable that people who didn't even want to get there had to get there. We're in a very different political situation today. Valerie Grader yesterday was basically saying we're going to do it voluntarily, we'll do it with incentives, we'll reach the 40% goal by doing that. Do you have any thoughts on this current political situation, things that you would encourage us all to be doing?
So I do have thoughts on this. Just a couple of things briefly. There are many things, but a couple of things that I think are really important. Talked about the demand side and the business world making the case. If someone's going to go to the legislature and the governor's office, and if the Apples and Googles and Facebooks say, our investment in your state is contingent on having a low carbon power supply because that is what we're looking for, that can be influential. More influential, I think, than that is something that, and this is not my area, which will be evident in a moment, cultural cognition. People are different, they're in different groups, they have different ideologies, different politics, and if we're going to talk about energy and climate change, it needs to come from their peers, bringing that message from trusted sources to them in their language. So, Deb Dooley, who started Green Tea with your organization in Georgia, we need her in Michigan. We have Interfaith Power and Light doing great work in Michigan. We have the Conservative Energy Forum doing great work in Michigan. Thus far, it hasn't been enough, but we need more of that. We need more people within groups who are, schooled in these issues, doing the communication.
Yeah, right.